been approved, and he got into serious trouble with his employers in Arnstadt for that. While in Lübeck, he would have heard Buxtehude's dazzling organ playing, and he later assimilated many of the elements of Buxtehude's North German style into his own work. And in this prelude and fugue, you can hear some of those elements. The improvisatory passages, the long pedal solo, changes in meter, say from 3 in a bar to 4 in a bar and then back again. The fugue subject contains a lot of repeated notes, and that's another North German trait. After the Bach, I'm going to play 3 short pieces from a suite by Louis-Nicolas Clérambault. He was a Parisian musician who lived in roughly the same time as Bach, and he was the organist of Saint-Sulpice, which is the second largest church in Paris after the Cathedral of Notre Dame, and home to one of France's largest organs. French organ music of the 17th and 18th centuries was shaped by the colourful instruments on which it was played, and certain musical forms and textures became synonymous with certain sounds. For example, a French organ fugue from this period would always have been played on a trumpet stop. The last of the pieces in the group I'm going to play today has a long title. It is called Basse et dessus de trompette ou de cornet en dialogue. Now, there's quite a lot to unpack and translate there. Basse et dessus means bass and treble, and en dialogue means in dialogue. In other words, the melody alternates between the right hand and the left hand, the bass and the treble. The mention of the trompette, that's a trumpet stop. And another stop that is mentioned is the cornet. It's spelt cornet, but it's got nothing to do with the brass instrument. It's a compound stop of 5 ranks. And that means that for each note that I play on a cornet, there are 5 pipes of different pitches all sounding together. In my performance, I'm using a trumpet stop when the tune is in the left hand and the cornet when it's in the right hand. The accompaniment is played on a different sound on another. Sorry, I just got to unmute myself. Tim muted me. She doesn't like what I'm saying. Where was I? Yes. Anyway, I mean, one reason for choosing this music is that the organ at Chichester Cathedral has lots of these French type colours that are so suitable for this music. And in the second piece, the trio, you can hear a stop called the cremona, and that's an anglicised form of cremorne, which is a French organ stop intended to imitate a Baroque reed instrument of the same name. After the Clérambault, we're going to fast forward a couple of centuries and cross the English Channel for 2 pieces by Percy Whitlock. He lived in the first half of the 20th century. He studied with Stanford and Vaughan Williams, and he combined a position at St. Stephen's Church in Bournemouth with the post of town organist, in which capacity he played regularly on the theatre organ at the Bournemouth Pavilion. So he was, at the same time as being a really serious musician, he was also an entertainer. And a lot of his compositions have a lightness and geniality that belie proper musical rigor and discipline. And this is certainly true of the 2 pieces you'll hear today. The Divertimento is a whimsical scherzo with a very fast part in the right hand for a flute stop. And the fanfare has a lovely lyrical romantic middle section framed by the sort of jolly bombastic music you'd expect from a piece called fanfare. Then we're going back to Paris for the rest of the programme. Charles-Marie Widor is famous for one piece of music, the toccata from his 5th organ symphony, which has been popular at weddings ever since Princess Margaret got married to Anthony Armstrong Jones. But Widor was a much more substantial figure in French culture than his current reputation implies. He pioneered the French organ symphony, and he wrote 10 works in that genre, but he also wrote songs, ballet music, piano concertos, concertos for cello and violin, orchestral symphonies, chamber music, and choral works. In 1870, Widor was appointed organist of Saint-Sulpice in Paris. That's the church where Clérambault had been organist a century and a bit before. And he held that position until 1933, when he retired at the age of 89. There's a warning there for the Dean and Chapter of Chichester. I might be around for some time. He was professor of organ at the Paris Conservatoire for 37 years from 1890. He was a highly regarded music critic and a revered cultural ambassador for France. It is also known that Widor had an eye for attractive young ladies. The composer Edgar Varèse recalled arriving for a lesson at Widor's apartment in Paris one afternoon, and eventually the great man answered the door in his dressing gown and told his student to come back later because he was busy. Widor did eventually settle down. He got married at the age of 76 to a woman 40 years his junior. The idea of the organ symphony was motivated by rapid advances in organ design and technology during the 19th century. At the start of Widor's life, many organs in Europe would have been quite familiar to musicians of the previous century, including Bach and Mozart. But by the end of Widor's life, organs had electric blowers, high wind pressures, advanced mechanisms for controlling the stops, and vastly expanded tonal palettes. That's to say, lots more colors and sounds. Widor's organ symphonies were in part a response to these innovations in organ design, by which the organ's expressive qualities could keep pace with those of the developing symphony orchestra. And in the movement from his 8th symphony that I'm going to play today, you will see on the video what is required of the player to make use of all this expressive potential. So there are lots of quick changes from one manual to another. There's frequent and ideally subtle use of the swell pedal. That's a device for making crescendos and diminuendos by opening shutters on front of the box in which pipes are contained. Registration changes. That's the use of different stops. When we talk about registration, that's the choice of stops that we use. And all of this has to be done while playing the notes of the piece, which is in fact quite a task in itself. Widor's predecessor as professor of organ at the Paris Conservatoire was César Franck, and it is one of Franck's last compositions that concludes today's programme. In July 1890, Franck was riding in a cab that was struck by a horse-drawn trolley, and poor Franck sustained a head injury. Although he seemed to make a quick recovery, it seems the accident precipitated a sharp decline in his health. He found walking increasingly painful, and he had to give up his teaching and performing. And perhaps knowing that time was short, Franck dedicated himself to the composition of his 3 chorales for organ that turned out to be his last compositions. Now, the word chorale in French is used just like the English word choral as an adjective. In other words, it describes music sung by a choir. And we might wonder how it applies to an organ piece. And I think there were 2 answers to this. All 3 of Franck's chorales contain hymn-like passages with a texture reminiscent of choral music. And in the piece I'm playing today, you can hear such a passage about halfway through, and it's repeated again right at the end. And it's easy to imagine these sections transcribed for choirs to sing. The second answer to the question, why chorale, has a more spiritual slant. Franck was a pious and deeply religious person, and choral textures, with their connotations of the church, can convey a certain solemnity and seriousness. And it seems very plausible to me, anyway, that that was his intention here. The second chorale, which I'm going to play today in B minor, takes the form of a Passacalia. A Passacalia is an extended set of variations on a single melody. And this melody is often, but not always necessarily, in the bass part. You'll hear it in the pedals at the very start of the piece with a sort of tolling bell accompaniment. And we might wonder if Franck almost had his funeral procession in mind as he wrote it. But it is by no means a dreary or a somber piece all the way through, because over the next 13 minutes, the theme, although never far away, is put through the panoply of musical filters, harmonic, textural, and contrapuntal. And the theme appears as many different characters during the course of the piece. Sometimes it's in plain sight, and sometimes it's so well disguised that you would hardly know that it's there. It's a wide-ranging emotional journey, this piece, but it's a satisfying one that is held together by this unifying element of the main theme. And I can tell you that there's an opportunity to hear another of Franck's chorales next Tuesday, when Tim is going to play chorale number 3, I think at the end of his recital. So once again, thank you for your support of this lunchtime series and your interest in this pre-concert talk. We're all looking forward to the day when we can meet in the cathedral once again, but hope that in the meantime, you will enjoy these online performances.